I still remember the exact weight of my phone in my hand that Thursday evening, because it felt heavier after I read the message than it had before. I just switched off the lamp over my workbench in the back room, the one I still keep even though the shop's been closed for 3 years, and I was rubbing my right hand the way I do every evening now, working the stiffness out of fingers that used to hold a loop steady for 6 hours at a stretch. Outside, the wind was coming hard off Grand Traverse Bay, rattling the storm windows, and my knuckles had already told me a front was moving in before the radio ever mentioned it. At 64, my hands know things the weatherman finds out later. The phone buzzed once on the counter. I smiled before I picked it up. 3 days before your daughter's wedding, you assume every message is good news. Then I read it. Dad, please stop asking about Derek's parents. They're not coming to the wedding. It's just easier this way. I read it twice, then set my glasses higher on my nose and read it a third time, thinking maybe the light in the shop was playing tricks on old eyes. It wasn't. I stood there with my thumb over the screen while the coffee I'd forgotten I was making finished dripping behind me, and the back room, usually the one place in my life that still felt orderly, suddenly felt very small. 8 years earlier, after Helen died, I promised myself Claire would never feel like she'd lost two parents in 1 year. I kept the shop open 6 days a week even after my hands started shaking too much to trust with a customer's heirloom watch. I sold Helen's car to cover the gap year Claire needed after the funeral. I learned to make a passable pot roast from a library cookbook because Sunday dinner had always been Helen's job, and I wasn't going to let that disappear too. I paid for the dorm deposit, the used Corolla, half the down payment on her condo, and 3/4 of this wedding, and somehow, after all of that, simply knowing who my future son-in-law's parents were had become too much to ask. I looked over at Helen's photograph on the shelf above the register, the one where she's laughing at something just out of frame, wearing the green cardigan she always said made her look like a schoolteacher. You'd have had something to say about this, I told her quietly. The shop, of course, didn't answer. After a while I typed back, okay, no questions. I set the phone face down on the counter, and the quiet that followed hurt worse than the message had. Claire called about 20 minutes later. Dad. Hey, sweetheart. You're not upset, are you? There was something in her voice that wasn't quite worry. It was closer to someone checking whether a problem had stayed contained. I told her I understood, mostly to end the conversation, and asked, gently, whether Derek's family had some kind of falling out. She sighed. It's complicated, Dad. Families are complicated. I wasn't asking for their whole history, I said. I just thought parents usually meet before their kids get married. A pause stretched out longer than it needed to. You'll understand eventually, she said. I hope so, I told her. She changed the subject to seating cards. Before she hung up, she said, love you, the way she always had, quick and automatic, and I said it back, and neither of us had answered the actual question. The following evening, I drove my old Wagoneer into town for dinner with the two of them. It's a 1985, wood paneling faded to the color of weak tea, one door that doesn't quite latch on the first try. It runs fine, mostly the way I do. The restaurant Derek picked sat right on the water, all reclaimed barn wood and hanging filament bulbs, the kind of place where the servers know which bottle of wine goes with which entree without asking. Claire hugged me at the door, looking radiant and nervous in that particular way brides get 3 days out. She has Helen's laugh exactly, which undoes me every single time. Then Derek came around the table, shook my hand with both of his the way men do when they're performing warmth rather than feeling it, and said, Mr. Doyle, please call me Derek. I mean that. I appreciate everything you've done for Claire. His smile had the kind of polish you only get from practicing in a mirror. Dinner went pleasantly enough through the appetizers. Claire talked about the florist. I complained about the ferry schedule changing again. Derek told a long story about a commercial lease he'd closed that had the whole table laughing at the right moments. If a stranger had walked past, they'd have seen an ordinary family enjoying an ordinary meal. Maybe that's exactly why I chose that moment to set down my fork and ask, casually as I could manage, when I might finally get to meet his folks. Claire's eyes went to Derek immediately, not with surprise, but with the reflex of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this question to land on somebody else's plate. Derek dabbed his mouth with his napkin before he answered. "Mr. Doyle, my family has some history that's difficult for them." I nodded and said I understood, that everyone has history. He leaned in, just slightly. "I only hope you care about Claire enough not to go digging at things that would hurt people." It was polite on its face and something else entirely underneath. He hadn't answered my question. He'd made asking it sound like an act of cruelty. "I noticed Claire watching me the way you watch a pot you're hoping doesn't boil over." And I could have pushed. Instead, I asked quietly whether his parents were simply not coming at all. Claire answered before he could. "No," she said, and then added something that landed harder than she probably intended. "They come from a very different world than us." I asked what that meant. She looked embarrassed and said she just didn't want anything to feel awkward. Awkward. Such a small, harmless word. Except I understood exactly what she was really telling me. She wasn't talking about Derek's parents being difficult. She was talking about me. The retired watchmaker whose good jacket came from the outlet mall. The man with the rattling old Jeep and the trembling hands. For the first time since Helen's funeral, I wondered if my own daughter had started seeing me the way somebody else wanted her to. I forced a smile and said we all just wanted the day to go smoothly. Relief spread across her face like she thought the subject was closed. Driving home along the shoreline road, past the cherry orchards and the porch lights coming on one by one, I told myself I was being an old fool. Maybe Derek's family really did have some private wound. Maybe Claire was only trying to keep the peace. I wanted very badly to believe that. Around 10 that night, my laptop chimed. It was the wedding coordinator, and I assumed it was another reminder about rehearsal timing. Instead, the subject line read updated seating draft. Please disregard, sent, I guess, about 4 minutes before she caught her mistake and tried to recall it. I almost closed the email without opening it. Instead, I scrolled through the table assignments out of pure habit, the way you check a crossword answer you already know. Groomsmen, my cousins, my own name at the head table. Then my eyes stopped at table 6. 2 names. Arcade. Ecade. I blinked and scrolled back up, certain I'd misread it. I hadn't. Not Voss. Not unable to attend. Not blank. 2 assigned seats under a name I had never once heard in 3 years of Claire dating this man. My pulse, strangely, slowed instead of racing, which has always been my particular curse. The worse something feels, the calmer I get. I printed the page, set it beside my cold coffee, and read it again. The coordinator hadn't marked anybody absent. She'd reserved them chairs. Somebody had expected 2 people named Cade to sit at my daughter's wedding, which meant somebody had been lying to me for a very long time. I looked over at Helen's picture. "Something's wrong," I said to the empty kitchen, "and I think our girl is standing right in the middle of it." By morning, I'd nearly talked myself out of caring. I woke at 5:30 out of 40 years of habit, fed the 2 barn cats that had adopted me after Helen passed, and sat with the seating chart and a legal pad while my tea went cold. I wrote one line at the top. Who are the Cades? Then I crossed it out. Maybe it was an old business partner. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself I was done chasing shadows, and 10 minutes later, I was in the Wagoneer heading for the county register of deeds anyway, because 30-some years of running a small business teaches you one true thing. Most information that feels secret is actually just sitting in a public file drawer, waiting for somebody patient enough to look. The clerk at the counter pointed me toward a terminal and told me to help myself. I typed in Cade. 60-some results came up, mostly unrelated. A retired couple in Sutton's Bay. A farm parcel sold a decade back. Nothing that meant anything. After an hour, my neck ached, and I laughed at myself out loud. "What exactly are you doing, Walt?" The clerk glanced over, and I told her retirement gives a man too much time on his hands. She smiled and said you'd be surprised how many people come in here trying to solve family mysteries, and she hoped most of them found happy endings. I told her I hoped so too, and I meant it more than I let on. I stopped for lunch at the Cherry Pit, the diner where I've ordered the same tuna melt for 20 years. The waitress asked what was on my mind, and before I could stop myself, I told her my daughter was getting married Saturday. Her whole face brightened, and I said it should be wonderful. and something in my voice must have betrayed me, because she just refilled my cup and said sometimes weddings bring out strange things in families, and left it at that. By early afternoon, I decided the whole search had been foolishness, and I was halfway home when my phone rang. Peg, Helen's older sister, who never calls just to talk. "You sound tired," she said before I'd even said hello. "I've been chasing ghosts," I told her, and she asked what kind. I told her everything. The text, the dinner, the seating chart, the name Kate. She went quiet for a long moment. Then, slower than usual, she said, "Walt, I haven't heard that name in years." Something in my chest tightened. "Why?" I asked. "You remember all that business after Helen's surgery?" she said. Of course I remembered. Boxes of paperwork, an attorney, a settlement I'd signed because I couldn't afford to keep fighting while also paying for Claire's second semester. Peg said, "I could swear the administrator over at Lakeview was named Ellen Cade before she remarried." I pulled the wagoneer onto the shoulder without quite deciding to. "What?" I said. "I might be wrong," Peg said, "but you don't forget a name like that." I remember her because she scared people. My fingers went white around the wheel. "Peg, I think that was the woman who ran the rehab wing when your sister died in it." I drove straight back to the Register of Deeds instead of home. This time I searched differently. Not Cade the person, but Cade the business. One entry caught my eye. Cade Family Holdings LLC, registered in Northport. I clicked through. Managing member, Richard A. Cade. Not Voss. Cade. The registered address sat 11 minutes from my own front door. 11 minutes. Claire had told me Derek's parents wouldn't be at the wedding. She had never once mentioned they practically lived around the corner. The rain had started again by the time I turned north toward Northport, that fine mist that hangs in the air rather than falling through it. My hand ached on the gearshift every time I changed speed. I stopped at a gas station to buy water and aspirin, sat in the parking lot watching ordinary people load ordinary groceries into ordinary cars, and told myself I was too old to be playing detective in a strip mall parking lot. Then I drove the last mile anyway. The neighborhood surprised me. Wide lots, cedar shake homes, quiet money rather than loud money. I parked across the street and waited. After about 15 minutes, a dark green Land Rover pulled into the driveway. Derek climbed out, and he wasn't alone. Claire stepped out of the passenger side, laughing at something he'd said. The front door opened, and a woman somewhere in her 60s came hurrying out to meet them. Claire hugged her, easily, the way you hug someone you've known for years, not the way you greet a stranger's mother for the first time. A tall, gray-haired man followed behind her, and Derek clapped him on the shoulder like old friends do. They looked entirely comfortable together, not like people hiding a painful rift. Like family. Something in my stomach dropped straight through the floor of the truck. Claire had known. She hadn't simply repeated a story Derek told her. She had looked me in the eye at that dinner table and lied to my face. About 20 minutes later, the four of them left in two cars, and I followed at a careful distance, not because I wanted to spy on my own daughter, but because I needed, badly, to understand. They stopped at a small cafe between a hardware store and a dry cleaner. I took a booth near the front window where I could watch their reflection in the glass without watching them directly. Most of the conversation dissolved under the clatter of dishes, but every so often a sentence carried. "After the wedding, he'll come around," someone said. "The cottage is the cleanest asset we've got." I frowned at the word cottage. Then another voice, older, probably Richard's. "Old cases don't come back to life unless somebody pays to dig them up." Something about the ease with which he said it made my stomach turn, like he'd said that particular sentence before, to other families, in other rooms. The waitress brought my pie. I barely touched it. Across the cafe, Derek pulled a folder from his bag and slid several pages toward Claire. She skimmed them for a few seconds and signed without a single question. When she turned a page, I caught a few words upside down through the window glass. Family transfer. Asset planning. At the bottom of one sheet, Cade Family Holdings. I couldn't read the rest, and I didn't need to. Whatever she'd just signed involved his family, not mine. Not yet. But every instinct I had told me this had nothing to do with honeymoon plans. Then I heard something that froze me where I sat. The older woman lowered her voice, almost to a whisper, but the words carried anyway. Lakeview taught me one thing, she said, smiling faintly. People forget if you just give them enough time. My fork slipped out of my fingers and hit the plate. Lakeview. I hadn't said that word out loud in years. That was where Helen went after her hip surgery. That was where she died 9 days later. The noise of the cafe seemed to fall away around me, and for one impossible second I could hear the phone ringing at 2 a.m. 8 years ago, a voice telling me there had been complications. I paid my bill without finishing the pie and drove home in silence. The house smelled the way it always does, cedar and old paperbacks and the ghost of coffee that's been sitting too long. I went straight to the hall closet, to the box I'd promised myself I would never open again. Helen's file box, hospital records, insurance correspondence, the settlement letter from the attorney. I carried it to the kitchen table and lifted the lid, and dust caught the light like something alive. My hands weren't steady, and for once that had nothing to do with age. Medical bills, medication logs, legal correspondence. Then, halfway down, a memo gone yellow at the edges. I stared at the signature at the bottom. 5 words in blue ink I hadn't seen in 8 years. Ellen Cade, Administrative Director. I sat down slowly. Outside, the rain kept tapping the windows, patient as a clock. Inside, the past had walked straight back into my kitchen and pulled out a chair. I barely slept that night, and by 6:30 I was back at the table with fresh tea and the whole contents of the box spread out like a crime scene, which I suppose, in its own quiet way, it was. Medical invoices, physical therapy paperwork, sympathy cards I'd never had the courage to throw away. Underneath those, a thick envelope from the attorney who'd handled the settlement, full of language I remembered too well. Continuing to pursue this matter could cost tens of thousands of dollars in litigation. I'd been paying Claire's tuition and the mortgage and a mountain of bills insurance hadn't covered, and I simply couldn't afford to keep fighting. So I'd signed. Not because I believed Lakeview had done nothing wrong, because grief had made me tired enough to surrender. Now Ellen's words from the cafe kept circling back. People forget if you just give them enough time. Maybe that hadn't been an offhand comment. Maybe it was closer to a business model. Around 10, I called Peg back. Tell me you found something, she said before I'd even said hello. I found Ellen's signature, I told her. I knew it, Peg said quietly. You really remembered her. I remember because everyone was afraid of her, I said. The aides, the families, even the attorneys acted differently whenever her name came up. Why didn't we keep fighting? I asked. Peg sighed. You were exhausted, Walt. So was I? They dragged everything out for months. Records went missing. Employees suddenly couldn't recall conversations they'd had 2 weeks earlier. And then, she said, they offered just enough money to make the bills go away. I knew exactly what she meant. Not enough to feel like justice. Just enough to make survival possible. They never convinced us they were innocent, Peg said. They convinced us we couldn't afford to prove they weren't. Before she hung up, she told me I should talk to Dorothy Pike, who'd run the activities program at Lakeview for 20 years. If anyone remembers every crooked administrator that ever walked those halls, Peg said, it's Dorothy. Finding Dorothy took most of the afternoon. She lived in a senior building over in Sutton's Bay, geraniums lining the front walk, a laminated sign about the Tuesday bingo pinned to the community board. An old man watering tomatoes near the entrance told me Dorothy still cheated at cards and pointed me toward apartment 118. She opened the door in a cardigan the exact shade of cherry red, a cane in one hand, and studied my face for a long moment before it clicked. You're Helen Doyle's husband, she said. It wasn't a question. She ushered me in, sat me at a little table by the window, and put out a plate of cookies she admitted were 3 days stale. They'll still beat the food at Lakeview, she said, and laughed at her own joke longer than it deserved. I asked her about Ellen Cade, and her smile disappeared. Oh, I knew Ellen, she said. She folded her hands very neatly, and so did everyone who worked under her. For the better part of an hour, Dorothy talked while I mostly listened. Ellen rarely raised her voice, she said. She didn't have to. She'd walk the halls in heels that clicked on the tile, and conversations just stopped when they heard her coming. Richard handled the money, Dorothy said. Ellen handled the fear. I wrote that sentence down word for word. She told me there'd been other families who asked hard questions over the years. Medication errors, she said. More than there should have been. Were they covered up? I asked. Cleaned up, she corrected me. Reports rewritten. Times adjusted. Initials added after the fact. I never once saw anybody forge a chart outright, she said, but I saw plenty of paperwork get tidier than it had any right to be. She got up, slower than she probably wanted me to notice, and came back with a thin folder from an old filing cabinet. Staff newsletters, handwritten notes, a few memos she'd quietly kept over the years because, in her words, something about them never sat right. One read, in part, reconcile medication logs prior to outside review. Signed at the bottom, Ellen Cade, Administrative Director. It isn't proof of anything specific, Dorothy said, but it proves how they thought. As we talked, another name surfaced. Did Derek ever come around the facility? I asked. Dorothy nodded. When he was maybe 15, 16. Helping his parents, she said, with a dry little laugh. Or that's what everybody called it. She remembered him making copies, running errands, answering the phone. Then her face changed. There was one incident, she said. A resident's daughter couldn't locate some paperwork about her mother's belongings, and I later found that boy practicing somebody's signature on a scrap of paper. Did anyone report it? I asked. He was a teenager, Dorothy said. His parents owned the place. Nobody wanted to lose a paycheck over something everybody agreed to call harmless. Sometimes people don't turn dishonest all at once, she said. Sometimes they just grow up believing the rules are for other families. Before I left, Dorothy handed me one more thing, a photocopy of a civil complaint filed a few years back. The names at the top made my stomach clench. Cade Family Holdings, and a widow out near Omina who claimed she'd been pressured into selling her lakefront property for far under its value. The case had settled quietly. No admission of wrongdoing. Another family too tired to keep fighting. At the door, Dorothy rested her hand on my sleeve. Walt, she said, if your girl marries into that family. She looked at me with the certainty of someone who had watched this exact story before. They won't just take the cottage. A long silence passed between us. And then, she said, they'll teach her to call it love. I drove home with the radio off. For the first time since Claire announced the engagement, I wasn't asking myself whether something was wrong anymore. I was asking how much time I had left to stop it. By the next morning, my kitchen looked less like a kitchen and more like the back office of a law firm that had lost a lease. Helen's file box sat open beside my cold tea. Dorothy's memo was clipped to the civil complaint. The seating chart had a yellow sticky note on it because my hands had started shaking every time I looked at those two names. I knew enough to be furious, and I knew myself well enough to understand that furious and useful are two very different things. I'd seen it at the shop over the years, a customer working himself into a rage over a $10 repair, saying things he couldn't take back over nothing at all. I couldn't afford that. Not with Claire's wedding 3 days out, not with Helen's name attached to any of it. So I called Renata Ostrander, the attorney who'd redone my will 2 years earlier, a woman with a way of looking over her glasses that made grown men sit up straighter in their chairs. Her office sat above the old bank building downtown, and when I walked in carrying Helen's box, she didn't smile. She just pointed at the chair and told me to sit down before I fell down. For nearly 40 minutes she read while I talked, the seating chart, the drive to Northport, the cafe, Lakeview, Dorothy, the old memo, the fresh complaint. She took notes on a yellow pad and circled a few things twice. When I finished, she took off her glasses and said, Walt, that's bad. Bad enough that you need to be very careful, she said. I felt my jaw tighten. You think I'm imagining this? I asked. No, she said. I think there are real patterns here, and I think this family has avoided being honest with your daughter about a great many things. But if you walk into that rehearsal dinner and accuse these people of causing your wife's death, they will make you look unstable before the appetizers are cleared. The words hit harder than I expected. Why, I asked. Because you're the widower, she said. Because you're the father of the bride. Because you followed them to Northport. Because grief gives dishonest people a very easy costume to put on you. I stared at Helen's memo on the desk between us. You don't need a scene, Renata said. You need proof. I have proof, I told her. You have pieces, she said. Pieces matter, but only if they're used the right way. I asked her what she wanted me to do. First, she said, you stop chasing them around the county. I started to argue, and she just raised an eyebrow until I stopped. Second, we make this about financial disclosure now, not old grief. Lakeview may matter enormously later, but if your goal right now is protecting Claire, the cleanest door in is a prenuptial conversation. Asset review. Debt disclosure. Anything tied to that LLC. Anything Derek refuses to put on paper becomes useful all by itself. For the first time in 2 days, my anger finally had somewhere productive to go. Renata slid a blank pad toward me. Tell Claire you want to give her and Derek a wedding gift, she said. What kind of gift? I asked. A legal consultation about protecting their future together, she said. Make it sound generous and a little boring. That feels dishonest, I told her. It's strategy, she said. I've never been any good at that. I know, she said. That's why you hired me. I almost laughed. Almost. Then my phone rang. Claire. I looked at Renata, and she nodded once. Answer it, she said. Dad, Claire said before I could even say hello, her voice tight and sharp. What did you do? My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? I asked. Derek says you were parked outside his parents' house. I stood up slowly. Claire, I saw something that worried me. You followed us. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to find out your own daughter lied to my face about people who live 11 minutes away? I said. Silence. And then, you don't understand. No, I don't, I told her. You're trying to ruin this because you don't trust anybody, she said. That isn't fair, Claire. You never really moved on after Mom died. That one landed exactly where she meant it to. Renata watched me carefully while I took one breath, and then another. I saw Claire at 22, standing beside Helen's casket in a black dress that was too thin for an October wind, shaking so hard I'd wrapped both arms around her just to keep her upright. And here she was on the phone, sounding like a stranger reciting somebody else's script. You're angry, I said finally. Of course I'm angry, she said. Come by tonight, I told her. No. Bring Derek. Absolutely not. I want to give you both something, I said. That stopped her cold. What? She asked. A wedding gift, I said. Legal planning, protecting your future together. If you two are building a life, maybe I should help you build it properly. There was suspicion in the pause that followed. What does that mean? She asked. It means my attorney can meet with all of us tomorrow morning, I said. We'll talk about the cottage, inheritance, anything worth protecting. And you'll stop digging, she said. I didn't answer the way she wanted. I'll stop guessing, I told her, which was, at least, honest. Derek showed up at Renata's office the next morning in a suit that cost more than my first car, and Claire came in beside him, pale, tired, her ring catching the fluorescent light every time she moved her hand. Derek thanked Renata for making time and told her I could be very protective. That's usually a parent's job, she said, without smiling. I sat quietly, which was the hardest part of the whole plan. Derek had come ready for an emotional old man to accuse him of something. I gave him paperwork instead. Renata explained that I'd asked her to help clarify estate and asset planning ahead of the wedding, so that if any family property was ever transferred, Claire would be protected. Derek leaned forward and said transparency mattered to him too, especially with a property involved. What property are you referring to? Renata asked. Derek blinked. Mr. Doyle's cottage, he said. I kept my face still. What's your understanding of its value? Renata asked. Derek said something about the lakefront market, threw out a number in the low 400s, close enough to accurate that Claire looked over at me, a question forming on her face. How did he know that? Renata asked if there was a mortgage. Derek said that would be my information, but he'd been asking about anticipated transfer timing, hadn't he? His smile thinned. I don't believe I used those words, he said. No, Renata said. I did. The room went very quiet. Then she slid a clean disclosure form across the desk, full asset and debt disclosure, LLC connections, pending claims, anything that might affect Claire after the marriage. Derek's fingers went still on the table. What LLC connections? Claire asked. Standard legal language, Derek said too quickly. Renata kept her voice perfectly pleasant. Cade Family Holdings would be one example, she said. All the color left his face for just a moment, long enough for me to see it. I don't know why that's relevant, he said. Then disclosing it should be simple, Renata said. That's private family business, he said, his jaw tight now. Claire said his name quietly. Derek. He turned to her, softening his whole face on command. Baby, this is exactly what I meant. Your father's turning a gift into an interrogation. I almost spoke. Renata's hand found my sleeve under the table, so I stayed quiet. Derek stood and said he needed to take a call. His phone hadn't rung. He stepped into the hallway, and the old door didn't quite latch behind him. His voice dropped, but carried. Not enough, he said. They're asking about the holdings company. Claire's head turned slowly toward the door. No, I never told her that part, he said. The silence in that room turned into something with weight to it. Claire looked at the door, then at Renata, then at me. What part? She whispered. I wanted to take her hand. I didn't. A moment later Derek came back and smiling, but something in Claire had already shifted. Not all the way, but cracked. I need time, she said suddenly. Derek froze. What? I need time, she repeated. She stood, grabbed her purse, and walked out before either of us could say another word. Derek looked at me, and for the first time all the politeness drained out of his face. You have no idea what you're doing, he said. No, I told him, but I'm learning fast. That night at 9:15 Renata called. Cade Family Holdings is tied to a bridge loan application, she said, no preamble at all. What does that mean? I asked. It means somebody's borrowing money against an inheritance they expect to receive soon, she said. My mouth went dry. What inheritance? I asked, though some part of me already knew. Renata's voice went as cold and flat as the lake in January. Your cottage, Walt. And your daughter's signature is already on paperwork tied to it. By Friday evening, the rehearsal dinner looked exactly the way Claire had pictured it for a year. String lights over the deck, white linens, the last gold light of a Michigan sunset laid flat across the bay. I arrived early, the way I always do, wearing the navy blazer Helen had bought me for my retirement party, insisting every man needs one good jacket that makes him stand up straighter. Claire looked up when I came in, and for 1 second I saw the little girl who used to search the bleachers at every school concert until she found my face. Then the moment passed. Hi, Dad, she said. You look nice. Neither of us hugged. That hurt more than I expected it to. Guests filled in slowly, co-workers, bridesmaids, a few cousins from both sides. Everyone laughing about nothing in particular while, underneath the small talk, several people in that room were already carrying secrets heavy enough to sink the evening. Derek arrived confident and relaxed, kissed Claire's forehead, worked the room. His parents came in a few minutes later, introduced simply as Rich and Ellen, no last name offered, no explanation needed, just enough truth wrapped around a lie to hold its shape. When Richard reached my table, he shook my hand and said it was nice to finally meet me. I looked at him for a beat too long before I answered. You too, I said. Neither of us smiled. Peg slipped in just before everyone sat down, in a dark green dress, carrying herself like a woman who'd stopped caring what anybody thought of her decades ago. You ready? She murmured. I don't know. I told her. She squeezed my shoulder. Good, she said. Anybody who enjoys this too much usually turns out to be the villain of it. I couldn't argue with that. Dinner started quietly. Wine glasses clinked. People traded harmless stories about college roommates and wedding disasters, and I barely touched my plate. Across the room, Ellen laughed at something one of Derek's business partners said, easy and comfortable, like Lakeview had happened to somebody else entirely. Renata arrived 20 minutes in, uninvited but not exactly crashing either, carrying a leather folio, nodding politely to the coordinator on her way to my table. No surprises, she murmured, setting several envelopes down beside my plate. Everything in here is public record or belongs to you outright. Thank you, I said. You only get one shot at this, she reminded me. And remember, let them talk. Derek stood to give his toast a half-hour later. He raised his glass and said something about honesty and family and building a future on trust, and Peg muttered under her breath, "That's rich," just loud enough for me to hear. The room laughed and clapped, and then I stood too, not fast, not for effect, just slowly enough that the conversations around the table faded out on their own. "I'd like to say something," I told the room. Claire looked nervous. "Dad, it'll only take a minute," I said. I waited until it was completely quiet. Then I said exactly what Renata and I had rehearsed. When Claire told me about this wedding, I told the room I was looking forward to meeting the family she was joining. I looked over at Rich and Ellen. I was told they couldn't come. A few confused looks passed around the tables. Imagine my surprise, I continued, when I found out they weren't just coming, they'd been living 11 minutes from my house the entire time. Silence dropped over the room like a sheet. Derek's smile went tight. "There's clearly some misunderstanding here," he said. "I don't think there is," I said. Ellen laughed softly. "We're private people," she said. "I respect privacy," I told her, holding up the seating chart. "I don't respect being lied to." The room had gone completely still. Renata quietly handed me the envelopes, and I walked the room slowly, setting one in front of Claire, one in front of Derek, one for Richard, one for Ellen, two for their business associates, one for Claire's maid of honor, whose family had known ours for 20 years. Nobody opened them right away. I sat back down. "You can read them now," I said. Claire opened hers first. Inside were copies of public records, the LLC filing, the civil complaint from the widow in Omina, the old Lakeview memo bearing Ellen's signature, and a short letter from Dorothy Pike confirming she'd worked there and kept those documents herself. Nothing confidential, nothing exaggerated, just facts laid out plainly. Derek's smile disappeared entirely. "This proves nothing," Richard said. "It proves more than you wanted anybody to know," Renata answered calmly. Ellen folded her papers with hands that had gone stiff. "This is harassment," she said. "No," Renata said. "It's documentation." Derek stood, pointing a finger at me. "This is because he never let go of the past," he said. "He blames my family for what happened to his wife." I answered quietly, "I blame your family for hiding from it." Claire looked between us, then at Derek. "Don't," he said, cutting her off before she could speak. "They're manipulating you," he told her. But she wasn't looking at either of us anymore. She was staring down at the LLC paperwork in her own hands. The dining room doors opened, and every head turned. Dorothy Pike came in slowly, leaning on her cane, wearing that same cherry-red cardigan, chin up despite the effort it clearly cost her. She walked straight toward Ellen. "Hello, Ellen," she said. The smile drained off Ellen's face entirely. "I haven't seen you in years," Dorothy said. "Not since Lakeview." Nobody in the room said a word. "I always wondered whether you'd ever tell people who you used to be," Dorothy went on. Ellen stood. "I don't know this woman," she said. Dorothy laughed, dry and short. "You knew me well enough to have me rewrite 2 of my incident reports," she said. A murmur ran through the room. Richard stepped forward. "That's enough," he said. Dorothy didn't even glance at him. "You always did let other people clean up after you," she said. Derek lost his composure first. "This is ridiculous," he said, grabbing Claire's wrist. "We're leaving." Claire looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Let go," she said. He held on tighter. "I said we're leaving," he repeated. Every conversation in the room had already stopped. Claire pulled her arm free. "No," she said. He stared at her. "What?" "No," she said again. She looked at the papers, then at Ellen, then at Richard, and finally she turned toward me, eyes filling with tears. "Dad," she said. My chest tightened painfully. She held up the old Lakeview memo, hands trembling. "What is this?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. She deserved the whole truth, not revenge, not anger, just the truth. "What happened to Mom?" she asked. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the air conditioning cycle overhead. I looked at Helen's photo on my phone screen before I met my daughter's eyes. "Your mother went into Lakeview to recover from hip surgery," I told her. "She never came home." Claire's shoulders started to shake. I spent years wondering if I'd only imagined my own doubts. I told her, looking directly at Rich and Ellen now. They settled the claim. They changed their name. They moved on with their lives. Then I looked back at Claire. But I never once stopped thinking about your mother. Nobody spoke. Even Derek had gone silent. The rehearsal dinner ended without anybody officially calling it, because the weight of everything that had just been said in that room had become heavier than any celebration could carry. Nobody canceled the dinner out loud. It simply stopped happening. Servers cleared plates nobody had finished. Guests gathered coats and slipped out with awkward half-waves instead of goodbyes, none of them entirely sure what they'd just watched or how to talk about it afterward. Claire never left her chair. She sat holding Renata's envelope in both hands while Derek paced behind her. "None of this proves anything," he said, for maybe the 5th time. She didn't answer. He turned to me. "You've poisoned her against my whole family," he said. "No," Renata said. "Documents don't poison anybody. Lying does." Richard rose from his seat. "We're leaving," he said. Ellen gathered her purse without meeting Dorothy's eyes even once, though she'd walked in looking perfectly composed only an hour earlier. As they reached the door, Dorothy called after them. "You know what always bothered me most?" she said. Ellen stopped but didn't turn around. "It was never the mistakes themselves," Dorothy said. "It's that you taught everyone around you to be more afraid of the truth than of what actually happened." Ellen hesitated only a second before walking out. Richard followed without a backward glance. Derek stayed behind. He knelt beside Claire's chair. "Baby," he said. She raised her eyes slowly. "You know me," he said. "I thought I did," she answered. "You do?" he insisted, reaching for her hand. She pulled it back. "Did you know about Lakeview?" she asked. He hesitated one full second too long. "I knew my parents used to run a facility years ago," he admitted. "And you never told me," she said. "It wasn't relevant," he said. She laughed once, and it wasn't a happy sound. "You let me believe your parents lived out of state," she said. "I was protecting you," he said. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You were protecting yourself." His face hardened. "You're making a mistake," he told her. She stood. "I already made it," she said, "and I'm done making it." Saturday morning arrived strangely quiet. No florist van pulled into the venue. No hairstylist rushed through the hotel hallway. Instead, phones rang. Claire called the coordinator, then the caterer, then the photographer, absorbing one cancellation fee after another. By noon, everyone who'd planned to attend already knew the wedding was off, not through drama, just through simple, exhausted phone calls. The following week moved the way real life actually moves, slow and unglamorous. Renata didn't file dramatic lawsuits or call the local news. She simply forwarded public records and a few newly volunteered statements to the right regulatory offices and attorneys, and then things happened almost entirely without our help. One of Derek's business partners called her first, admitting the holdings company had used projected inheritance money to court investors as proof of future liquidity. A second investor confirmed the same story. Then a widow from Omina called, having read a small item in the local paper about a canceled society wedding, wanting only for someone to finally believe her about the property she'd been pressured into selling for far below its worth. None of these things alone proved fraud. Together, they gave investigators a picture they could no longer look away from. Financial records were requested. 2 pending real estate deals involving Derek collapsed within a month. Things have a way of catching up with people once enough light finally reaches them. Claire didn't come by for 11 days. I counted, though I told myself I wasn't counting. On the 12th afternoon, I heard her old Corolla in the driveway. She got out wearing a college sweatshirt, no makeup, hair pulled back, looking 26 and 19 at the same time, the way she had at Helen's graveside all those years ago. I opened the door before she reached it. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Hi," I said back. Neither of us moved for a second. Then she said, "I'm sorry," very quietly, and I stepped aside and told her to come in. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd first opened Helen's file box. Neither of us touched the tea for a long while. "I kept telling myself you were overreacting," she finally said. "I know," I told her. "I thought you hated him," she said. "I never hated him," I said. I was afraid of him. She nodded slowly. I should have listened, she said. You should have asked more questions, I told her, gently. A tear slid down her cheek. I lied to you, she said. You did, I agreed. I thought if we could just get through the wedding, she started and couldn't finish. I know, I said. She looked around the kitchen. So much of Mom is still here, she said. I smiled a little sadly. I wasn't ready to change any of it, I admitted. I'm glad you didn't, she said. After another long quiet, she cleared her throat and told me she owed money. Cancellation fees she'd already been paying down herself. I wasn't surprised. She looked at me with the same hopeful expression she'd had as a little girl asking for help with homework she'd put off too long, and started to ask, and couldn't finish the sentence. I understood anyway. I love my daughter, which is exactly why I answered her the way I did. I already paid what I promised toward this wedding, I told her. I know, she said quietly. I'm not paying the rest, I said. She nodded, not angry, just sad. I understand, she said. I'll help you make a budget, I told her. I'll help you find somebody to talk to. I'll help you rebuild, whatever that looks like. I reached across the table and took her hand. But I won't spend my pension or your mother's memory bailing you out of a decision you made after you stopped listening to me. She cried quietly for a while. I don't deserve that kind of patience, she said. This isn't patience, I told her. I squeezed her hand once. It's a boundary. Over the following weeks, things slowly reshaped themselves. Claire moved into a smaller apartment near town. She started seeing a counselor Renata recommended. She picked up freelance design work on the side until the last of the cancellation fees were paid off. We had dinner most Sundays, some of them easy, some of them painfully quiet, and I came to understand that healing rarely happens all at once. It happens one honest conversation at a time, usually over a meal that's gone slightly cold. About a month later, I drove out to the cemetery with a bundle of daisies, because Helen always said she preferred flowers that didn't try too hard. I knelt as carefully as my knees and hands would allow. Hi, sweetheart, I said. The wind moved through the pines behind me. Took me long enough, I said, and told her everything. About Claire, about the wedding that never happened, about Dorothy and Renata, and how frightened I'd been that protecting our daughter might cost me our daughter entirely. Then I just sat with her a while in the quiet, not because I had anything left to say, but because I finally felt like she already knew all of it. These days the shop's still closed, my hands still ache before a storm rolls in off the bay, and the Wagoneer still starts a little rough on cold mornings. But something in me has shifted for good. For years I confused sacrifice with love. I believed that being a good father meant saying yes often enough that my daughter would never feel a single hardship I could prevent. I was wrong about that. Sometimes the most protective thing a parent can do is find the courage to say no before it's too late to matter. I love Claire exactly as much as I always have. That part never changed. What changed is my understanding that love without any boundaries eventually turns into permission, and permission is precisely what people like Derek and his parents spend their whole lives hunting for. Looking back, I don't think the real victory was that the wedding never happened. I think the real victory was that the truth finally got a chance to breathe in a room that had been holding it in for 8 long years. I couldn't undo what happened to Helen, but I could refuse to let silence keep hurting the people I still had left to protect. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace in your family and telling the truth that might break it wide open, you already know exactly how heavy that choice can be. I'd genuinely love to hear, down in the comments, what you would have done in my place. Thank you for spending this time with me.